This is episode 2 of Journey Through Persia, a treasure trove of memories, written by Abdul Malik Hashmi and read by Sonia. A load of money and a lesson or two. Before setting off for Iran, I made sure to jot down a list of all the essentials I'd need. But the real head-scratcher was the money. Heaven help me if I got there and found out that even a measly cup of tea required enough banknotes to paper a barn. Back in July 2001, one Pakistani rupee would fetch you 27 Iranian riyals. But now, that same rupee had puffed itself up to a kingly 147 riyals. I picked up some Iranian currency from the money changers in Quetta's Kandahari Bazaar, and let me tell you, I'd barely tucked away a couple of wads when my pockets swelled up like a pair of prize-winning pumpkins at a county fair. I felt like one of those old-time treasure hunters lugging around a chest of gold, except my treasure was worth less than a stale biscuit in a beggar's hand. Now, I might not be the sharpest tool in the shed, but I ain't completely foolish either. A man ought to have a backup plan in case the river runs dry. So, just to be safe, I stuffed $100 and 500 Saudi riyals into my bag. That way, if I ever got sick of carting around this worthless heap of confetti, I could trade it in for something that didn't require a wheelbarrow to carry. I was headed to Iran, sure, but it felt more like I was off to some cursed kingdom where folks were drowning in money they couldn't use for much of anything. Once I got there, I exchanged $50, and that's when the real fun began. My pockets, I swear, filled up faster than a preacher's plate on Sunday. Every time I took a step, the banknotes flapped around like they had a mind of their own. The faster I walked, the wilder they danced like a flock of startled pigeons taking off in all directions. Folks on the street stopped and stared, as if they were watching some two-bit magician who, instead of pulling rabbits out of a hat, was conjuring up a never-ending stream of useless cash. Now, I've found myself in a fair number of ridiculous situations in my time, but this one took the cake. I hurriedly crammed as many bills as I could into my briefcase only to be struck by another fine thought. What if someone up and ran off with the whole thing? In the blink of an eye, I'd go from a man rich in worthless money to just plain worthless. But I needn't have worried. Turns out, the Iranian folks were about as honest a bunch as I'd ever come across. Not a soul looked at me sideways, and not one set of eyes lingered on my briefcase long enough to give me a lick of doubt. This was my first time traveling beyond my own backyard, and let me tell you, I got schooled real quick. Every step was a fresh lesson in the art of not knowing what the devil you're doing. But maybe that's the charm of it all, learning things the hard way, falling on your face, and then getting up with a grin because you finally figured out what went wrong. I sure did. And by the time my journey ended, I realized I hadn't just been to Iran, I'd been on one fine adventure, the kind a man don't forget too soon. A currency adventure in Kerman and Tehran. During my stay in Iran, I had my first run-in with the local currency in Kerman. I strolled into the bank, all innocent-like, and handed over my crisp $50 bill. The bank officer on the other side of the counter gave me a look, the kind a man gives when he's deciding whether to trust a horse trader, then set to counting with a solemnity that suggested he was performing a sacred ritual. When he was done, he pushed a stack of notes toward me, 397,900 Iranian riyals. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen what nearly 400,000 riyals looks like, but let me tell you, it doesn't look like wealth. It looks like someone emptied a paper factory onto the counter. I stared at it, half expecting a brass band to start playing, but no, it was just me and this mountain of bills, and the quiet realization that I had somehow turned my $50 into a logistical nightmare. A few days later, I tried my luck again in Tehran. The gentleman behind the counter was a shade less generous and handed me 396,700 riyals. It seemed that even money had a different flavor depending on where you were standing. But the slight difference in exchange rates didn't bother me much. The real problem wasn't the value, it was the sheer bulk of the stuff. Iranian banknotes came in all shapes and sizes, like a mismatched litter of puppies. The smallest was the 100 riyal note, which looked like it had been rescued from the bottom of a shipwreck. The largest was the 100,000 riyal note, which at least carried itself with some dignity. In between, there was a whole parade of denominations, 200, 500, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, and 50,000 riyals. It wasn't a currency system, it was a full-fledged dynasty, with the 100 riyal note as the frail and pitiful youngest child, and the mighty 100,000 riyal note reigning as the wise old patriarch. And just when you thought it couldn't get any wilder, they had introduced million riyal checks that weren't really checks at all, just oversized banknotes pretending to be important. When the bank officer solemnly stacked the hefty wads of cash before me, he had the air of a man officiating a royal ceremony. He mostly handed me 10,000 and 5,000 riyal notes, perhaps out of kindness, knowing that if he gave me smaller denominations, I'd end up walking around like a peddler with sacks of paper strapped to my back. I tried stuffing the bundles into my pockets, but my pockets objected immediately, as if to say, "Sir, we were designed for carrying respectable sums of money, not entire forests worth of banknotes." In the end, I had to distribute the bills like a man smuggling contraband, some in my briefcase, some in my coat, and others tucked between the pages of a book, hoping I'd remember where I'd put them when the time came to pay for something. And so, I learned an unexpected lesson in Iran. The true challenge in life isn't making money, it's figuring out where to put the stuff once you've got it. Had I been wiser, I might have begged the bank officer in Persian.
آقا، اسکناس‌های بزرگ پول را به من بدهید تا بتوانم آن را راحت حمل کنم.
Which, as far as I understood, meant, "Sir, give me the big bills so I don't have to haul this mess around like a traveling circus." But it was too late for regrets. I took what was given to me, nodded like a man who had just signed away his soul, and walked out of the bank, pockets bulging, briefcase groaning, and destiny laughing at my expense. The wild and wayward tale of the Iranian riyal. Now, folks, let me tell you a story so old and full of ups and downs, it might as well be an old mule on a rocky mountain trail. This is the tale of Iran's currency, which spent centuries playing a grand game of hide and seek with history vanishing, reappearing, changing names, and generally making a nuisance of itself. And where does this tale begin? Why, in the days of the Qajar dynasty, when a certain King Fath Ali Shah Qajar sat upon the throne, a fellow more famous for his beard than his battles. If you asked a painter about him, he'd say, "That beard. Why, it was longer than a winter in the mountains and flowed like the Mississippi after a heavy rain." Ask one of his courtiers, and he'd shake his head and mutter, "A waist so slim you'd think a gust of wind might snap him in two, and a brood of children so large you'd need a census to count them." And sure enough, history remembers Fath Ali Shah not for wisdom or war, but for his showy whiskers, his waspish waist, and a family tree that put the jungle to shame. It was under this bearded monarch's rule, in the year 1798, that the riyal came into this world, Iran's first official currency, all bright-eyed and full of promise. It was split into 1,250 dinars, making it just a measly eighth of a tomon. The tomon strutted through the markets like a fine gentleman, while the riyal, poor thing, was eyed suspiciously, folks likely wondering if it would hold up in a stiff breeze or just vanish like a gambler's last dollar. But, as any riverboat gambler will tell you, luck don't stay put for long. Come 1825, the riyal got booted clean out of history, replaced by the kiran, a fancier, sturdier currency. It was like a rich city slicker rolling into town, buying up the best seats at the saloon, and making folks forget all about the old-timers. The riyal slunk off, forgotten, gathering dust in the back pages of the history books. But here's the thing about money, it's got a way of crawling back when you least expect it. Like a bad penny, it always turns up again. Then came the Pahlavi era, with Reza Shah and his son Mohammad Reza Shah taking the reins, until 1979 arrived like a thunderclap, bringing the Islamic Revolution and tossing the whole game board into the air. Iran's economy changed, its currency changed, everything changed. But still, if you flip back through history's pages, you can picture a certain Qajar king, sitting grand and pompous, stroking that great waterfall of a beard, as he signed off on a new coin for his kingdom. And I'd wager a few coins of my own that somewhere in that royal court, a weary old advisor leaned over and whispered, "Your Majesty, the new currency is all well and good, but honestly, did we really need quite so many royal heirs?" The riyal in the furnace of revolution. Now, let me tell you something, money ain't just money. It's got a life of its own, a real ornery streak, like an old mule that won't walk straight no matter how hard you yank the reins. And the Iranian riyal? Well, that critter's been kicked, tossed, burned, and buried more times than a gambler's last dollar, but somehow, it still keeps turning up. Back in the days of the Qajars, The riyal sat high and mighty, strutting around like a rooster in a henhouse. Then the Pahlavis came along, gussied it up in royal silk, and paraded it around like it was something special. But times got a funny way of tarking the starch out of things, and when the revolution hit, that riyal went from sitting on a throne to scuffling in the gutters. Once, folks weighed it in gold. Now, they just counted how many of them it took to buy a loaf of bread, and let me tell you, it took a heap more than it used to. But money's a slippery thing, it don't go down easy. The riyal didn't just up and die, no sir, it kicked and hollered, clinging on for dear life. You'd see it getting battered around from one bank window to the next, sitting in shopkeepers' hands like a sick chicken, and shaking under the cold stare of inflation like a man who's just lost his last dime at the poker table. And here we are today, times are tough, the economy's got more knots in it than a sailor's rope, but that riyal? It's still breathing. Maybe it knows something we don't. Maybe it figures that as long as there's folks around to scrape and scuffle over it, it ain't going nowhere. Thrones may tumble, revolutions may come and go, but money? Well, money's like an old song, it don't never quite stop playing.